My name is Hartman. I was 47 years old when I died for the first time. I say it that way because I remember the moment my body stopped working, and I remember the moment I came back. There was no tunnel at first. No light. Just a sudden, clean break, like a switch flipped, and everything I thought I was fell away. 1 second I was standing in a hospital corridor, thinking about a lab result, and the next second I was gone from myself. I didn't feel pain when it happened. What I felt was confusion. A deep, quiet confusion, because nothing behaved the way it should have. I didn't fade out. I didn't drift. I was still aware, but the rules I had trusted my entire adult life no longer applied. I understood very quickly that my heart had stopped. That knowledge arrived fully formed, without panic. I also understood something worse. I had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. I had spent decades believing that consciousness was a byproduct. A chemical trick. Neurons firing, signals passing, a machine doing what machines do until they wear out. I taught that idea without hesitation. I built my career on it. So when I found myself present without a body, without breath, without a pulse, there was no comfort in it. There was embarrassment, a sharp awareness that the certainty I had lived with was now useless. I didn't feel judged. I felt exposed, like standing naked in a room I had sworn didn't exist. There was no sense of direction. No up or down, but there was clarity. I knew who I was. I knew my name, my age, my profession. I knew my wife's face. I knew my children's voices. And I knew, without being told, that I was not supposed to be aware anymore. That mismatch sat heavier than fear. Fear would have been easier. Fear fits into the old system. This did not. If this had been a hallucination, it was the most structured one I had ever encountered. If it was a dream, it was unlike any dream I had studied, measured, or dismissed. And if it was death, then death was not what I had spent my life explaining away to patients with calm smiles and clinical language. The strangest part was how calm I was. No rush, no struggle, just the growing realization that whatever had happened to me was not temporary, and that the story I had told myself about reality had just ended without warning. Before that day, my life was painfully ordinary. I woke up at 5:30 most mornings, showered quickly, drank burnt coffee from the same chipped mug, and checked my phone while tying my shoes. I worked as an internal medicine physician at a regional hospital, the kind that runs on routines and quiet exhaustion. My days were filled with charts, consults, hallway conversations, and the constant low-grade pressure of being responsible for other people's bodies. I was good at my job, careful, methodical, detached when needed. I believed detachment was professionalism. I didn't think much about death outside of work. When I did, it was abstract. An ending. A full stop. I told patients what science could support and avoided anything that sounded like comfort without evidence. I wasn't cruel. I was honest, at least by my own definition. When families asked questions that drifted toward meaning or purpose, I redirected gently. I believed it was kinder not to give people ideas I couldn't prove. At home, life moved on autopilot. Dinner at 7. News in the background. My wife reading on the couch while I answered emails. Weekends were for errands, minor repairs, and catching up on sleep. I exercised enough to feel responsible. I ate reasonably well. I assumed I had time. That assumption shaped everything. I delayed conversations. I postponed rest. I pushed away discomfort with the promise of later. Later was always available in my mind. There was no urgency, no reckoning. Just the steady belief that tomorrow would arrive like it always had. I didn't pray. I didn't search. I didn't feel lost. I felt complete in a narrow, efficient way. My explanations worked well enough to get me through the day, and that was all I asked of them. I trusted systems. I trusted measurements. I trusted that anything real could be observed, quantified, and eventually explained. And when something couldn't, I filed it away as unresolved rather than important. The morning it happened felt no different. I remember thinking about a meeting I wanted to skip. I remember being mildly annoyed by a headache I blamed on dehydration. There was no sense that anything was about to end. No warning. Just another day moving forward, right up until it didn't. It happened in the middle of a routine consult. I was standing, listening to a resident summarize a case I had already read. The room felt slightly smaller than usual, like the air had thickened. My vision narrowed, not dramatically, just enough to notice. I opened my mouth to interrupt, and nothing came out. There was no pain at first, just a sudden weakness, as if gravity had increased without telling anyone. I remember grabbing the edge of the counter, not in panic, but out of habit. My knees gave out before my mind caught up. The floor came closer in a way that felt wrong, too fast and too quiet. I didn't think, this is it. I thought, this is inconvenient. That thought embarrasses me now. Even then, my brain was trying to minimize what was happening. There was a pressure in my chest, not sharp, not crushing, more like a deep refusal. My heart felt as though it had decided to stop negotiating. Sounds became distant. The resident's voice stretched and blurred. Someone said my name, but it sounded like it came from another room. I was aware that people were moving toward me, that hands were reaching out, that protocols were starting to unfold. I had helped write some of those protocols. I knew exactly what they would do next. Then control disappeared completely. I wasn't fighting. I wasn't afraid. My body simply shut down, piece by piece, like a system powering off. Breathing stopped being automatic. Vision went dark without drama. There was a brief, clinical awareness that this was cardiac arrest, followed by something that didn't belong in any textbook. Instead of fading, I stepped away. Not physically. There was no sensation of rising or floating. It was more like my point of view detached from the failing machinery. The last thing I remember from my body was the sound of something hitting the floor, metal on tile. After that, the hospital was no longer around me, and I was no longer inside anything that could fail. There was no moment where I thought, I am leaving my body. It was already done by the time the thought could form. Awareness continued, but it no longer had weight. I noticed the room again, but from a position that didn't make sense. I could see the top of my own head. That detail still unsettles me. My hair was thinner than I remembered. A nurse was already on her knees beside my body, calling for help with a calm voice that didn't match the urgency of her hands. Someone else was pressing on my chest. Hard. Too hard, I thought, with mild irritation, as if the body on the floor was a patient I was supervising. I didn't feel loyalty to it anymore. That surprised me. There was no pull, no fear of losing it. The connection I had assumed would be permanent turned out to be optional. I understood that clearly. I was still myself, but the body had become an object. Useful, familiar, but no longer necessary. That realization didn't feel liberating. It felt factual. Time behaved differently. Events didn't stack in a line. I noticed details without choosing to. The color of the tiles. A crack in the ceiling paint. The rhythm of compressions. At the same time, I was aware that something else was present, not in the room, not visible, but close in a way that made the hospital feel thin, like a set piece rather than a place. There was no sound announcing it, no voice, just a shift in focus. The room dimmed, not visually, but in importance. My attention moved without effort, drawn towards something steady and unmoving. The panic I would have expected never arrived. Instead, there was a growing sense that observation itself was about to change. That whatever came next would not include the hospital. I did not think of God. I did not think of heaven. Those words belonged to other people, not to me. What I felt was recognition without context. Like noticing a presence you've somehow always known, even if you denied it. The air, if it can be called that, felt dense with awareness. Not emotion. Awareness. The hospital fell away without disappearing. It simply stopped mattering. And in that moment, suspended between what I had been and what I could not yet name, I understood that whatever was happening was not a side effect of oxygen loss or neurochemical chaos. It was too ordered, too consistent. I had spent years studying altered states. This was not one of them. This was something else entirely, and it was waiting. The presence did not arrive. It was already there. I became aware of it the way you become aware of someone standing behind you without hearing them move. There was no face at first, no shape I could point to, just a sense of attention directed fully at me. Not scanning, not evaluating, simply present. I felt known in a way that made explanation unnecessary. There was no fear in that awareness, but there was nowhere to hide. I didn't feel accused. I felt seen. Every assumption I had carried felt suddenly small, like tools built for the wrong task. I understood without being told that this presence was not impressed by credentials, titles, or certainty. Those things didn't register at all. Then the environment changed. Not abruptly. It unfolded. The space around me resolved into something clearer, though still not physical in the way I understood physics. There was light, but not directional. No shadows. No source. It illuminated without shining. The presence now felt distinct, closer, though distance still didn't apply. And with that closeness came recognition I could no longer avoid. I knew who I was standing before. Not by doctrine, not by memory, by direct awareness. The recognition was immediate and unwanted. Jesus, not the softened figure from art or the simplified version from cultural arguments. This presence was calm, grounded, and unbearably real. There was no announcement, no declaration. The recognition came from alignment, not words. I did not speak. I could not have formed an argument even if I wanted to. The need to debate, to challenge, to test hypotheses had no footing here. I felt like someone who had spent a lifetime studying a map only to discover they were standing in the territory itself. The map was not wrong. It was just insufficient. There was no condemnation in his presence. That surprised me more than anything. I had expected judgment, or at least correction. Instead, there was patience. Not indulgent patience. Honest patience. The kind that waits because it knows waiting is unnecessary, but allows it anyway. I understood that nothing needed to be proven. Everything already was. I became aware that my beliefs were not being attacked. They were simply irrelevant. They had served a purpose, but they could not survive here. And that realization, more than fear or awe, is what finally broke me open. What changed me was not a statement. It was seeing. I was shown my life, but not as a highlight reel or a list of failures. I saw it as a structure. Assumptions stacked on top of each other, forming something that looked solid from the outside. I had trusted that structure completely, built a life inside it, encouraged others to do the same. From where I now stood, the gaps were obvious. The load-bearing parts were thinner than I realized. I saw moments I had dismissed as coincidence, conversations I had cut short, questions I had redirected. Not because I was malicious, but because I was comfortable. Comfort had been my guiding principle, disguised as reason. I saw how often I chose certainty over curiosity, how I treated mystery as a temporary failure rather than an invitation. None of this was explained to me. I simply saw it, and seeing it was enough. The weight of it settled in without crushing me. It was heavy, but it was clean. There was no shame layered on top, just clarity. I understood that my mistake was not disbelief. It was reduction. I had taken something vast and flattened it until it fit inside my instruments. When it didn't fit, I assumed it didn't exist. That assumption now looked fragile, almost childish, in the presence of something that did not need my approval to be real. The correction did not come as instruction. It came as contrast. What I had trusted versus what was actually there. And in that contrast, my old confidence dissolved. Not violently, quietly. Like a theory abandoned because the data no longer supports it. I realized then that I had lived as though time were abundant and consequences were abstract. That realization did not come with threat. It came with sadness. Not his sadness, mine. And as that understanding settled, the space around us began to shift again, preparing me for something I was not ready to see but could not avoid. The next scene formed slowly, like fog thinning rather than a curtain lifting. I found myself standing near a narrow path. It wasn't symbolic in a dramatic way. No signs, no voices, just a simple stretch of ground moving forward into a distance I couldn't fully see. On either side, the ground dropped away, not sharply, but enough to notice. The path wasn't dangerous. It wasn't glowing. It was ordinary, almost boring, and that was the point. I understood without being told that this path represented choice, but not the kind I had imagined in life. There was no sudden decision, no single moment of commitment. The path existed because movement existed. Standing still was also movement here. You either continued or you didn't. As I looked at it, I became aware that I had been on this path my entire life without knowing it. Every assumption, every dismissal, every delayed conversation had nudged me slightly to one side or the other. None of it felt dramatic at the time. It had all felt reasonable, sensible. That was what unsettled me. The path didn't punish shortcuts. It absorbed them. By the time you noticed, you were already somewhere specific. I sensed Jesus beside me again, though he didn't point or speak. His presence wasn't directive. It didn't push me forward or block my way. It simply made it impossible to lie to myself about where I was standing. I noticed how my attention drifted toward the easier stretch of the path, the part that required no adjustment, no rethinking. That instinct was familiar. I had followed it for decades. What struck me was how quiet the choice felt. No pressure, no urgency, just the awareness that continuing as I was would carry me somewhere, whether I intended it or not. The path didn't care about my credentials. It responded only to alignment. I understood that choosing differently wouldn't feel heroic. It would feel inconvenient, slower, less efficient. That realization stayed with me longer than anything else I saw. Then the scene shifted again, and the path dissolved into something that looked, at first, like safety. I stood in front of a structure that resembled a building I might have trusted in life. Solid walls, clean lines, everything reinforced. It felt familiar, reassuring. This, I understood, was the version of security I had relied on. Knowledge, systems, predictability. The belief that if everything was measured correctly, nothing essential could go wrong. I stepped closer, and nothing happened. No collapse, no warning. That surprised me. It looked as stable as ever. I reached out, expecting resistance, and my hand passed through part of it. Not all of it. Just enough to reveal that the strength I assumed was there had never been consistent. Some sections held. Others were hollow, built for appearance rather than load. Pressure increased without force. The structure didn't explode. It sagged, quietly. Sections I had leaned on heavily gave way first. Not because they were attacked, but because they were never meant to carry weight. I understood that my sense of safety had been selective. I had trusted what worked for me and ignored what didn't. The collapse wasn't punishment. It was exposure. The final vision cut deeper than the others because it looked the most familiar. I saw two supports side by side. One looked impressive, wide, polished, frequently reinforced. The other looked unremarkable, narrow, almost overlooked. When pressure came, slowly and steadily, the impressive one began to fracture. Small cracks at first, invisible unless you were watching closely. The smaller support held without changing shape. I understood immediately what I was seeing. Outer appearance versus inner truth. What I projected versus what actually sustained me. My life had been built to look stable, competent, rational. But the parts that could actually bear weight had been neglected because they didn't announce themselves loudly. They required attention I never thought to give. There was no commentary on this. No explanation. Just the undeniable result when pressure arrived. The difference between what looks strong and what is strong became obvious, and there was no arguing with it. That was when the urgency began to surface, not as fear, but as clarity. Time had not been my enemy. Complacency had. And I could feel, without being told, that whatever came next would involve returning to a body that could still choose, but not forever. The sense of urgency didn't arrive like a warning. It settled in like a fact that had always been true, but ignored. I became aware of time again, not as minutes or dates, but as availability. There was a window, not measured, not negotiable, just open, for now. I understood that I had lived as though this window never closed. That belief had shaped every delay, every deflection, every time I chose efficiency over honesty. I was shown moments that had not happened yet. Not scenes, not predictions, just pressure. Situations where the weight of life would increase slowly, the way it always does. Illness, loss, uncertainty. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Just the kind of pressure that reveals what actually holds. I saw how little my old framework offered in those moments. How quickly my explanations would thin out when comfort was no longer an option. There was no threat in this awareness. No statement like, time is running out. It was quieter than that, more unsettling. Time was not hostile. It was simply finite. I felt a deep understanding that clarity does not wait forever. It presents itself, and then it moves on. I had been assuming I could always revisit questions later when life slowed down. Life does not slow down. It accumulates. The presence beside me did not rush me. That was the hardest part. There was no pressure to decide, only the knowledge that not deciding was itself a direction. I understood that returning to my life would not erase what I had seen, but it would test it, daily, subtly. The urgency came from knowing how easy it would be to explain this away once I was back inside pain, noise, and routine. I felt a pull then, not emotional, physical, heavy. The clarity I had been standing in began to thin. The space around me lost its steadiness. The awareness that had felt effortless now required focus. I sensed that whatever was holding me outside my body was releasing, not because it had to, but because it was time. There was no goodbye, no final instruction, just the understanding that I was being sent back with enough awareness to be responsible for what I did with it. And then responsibility itself became heavy, dense, and loud. Pain arrived first. Violent, Disorienting pain. My chest felt like it was collapsing inward. Air burned as it forked. Air burned as it forced its way back into lungs that didn't remember how to work. Sound slammed into me without sequence. Voices. Alarms. Someone shouting numbers. I tried to move and couldn't. My body felt foreign, oversized, uncooperative. Confusion followed. Thick and exhausting. I knew where I was, but not why. I knew something important had just happened, but the edges of it were already blurring. Light was harsh. Every sensation felt amplified and wrong. I became aware of tears on my face without remembering crying. My throat hurt. My ribs hurt. Everything hurt. I heard my name. Daniel. Again and again. This time it felt anchored to the body I was trapped inside. I wanted to tell them I was back, that I understood, that I needed a moment. What came out was a sound that didn't resemble language. Hands held me down gently. Someone told me to breathe, as if I had forgotten on purpose. The weight was the worst part. Not physical weight. Emotional. The clarity I had just stood in was gone, replaced by noise and effort. I felt smaller, slower, limited. The room felt thick with distraction. The hospital returned as a place of urgency and procedure, not insight. I realized how difficult it would be to hold on to what I had seen. Over the next hours, then days, pieces came back unevenly. Some details sharpened, others slipped away, but the core did not fade. I knew, with a certainty that survived medication and exhaustion, that I had not imagined it. That whatever I had encountered was more real than the room I woke up in. I was discharged with explanations that fit neatly into charts. Cardiac event, hypoxia, stress, dehydration. I accepted them outwardly. I needed to. But inside, those explanations felt incomplete in a way I could no longer ignore. I'm telling you this without asking you to believe me. I wouldn't have once. I'm telling you because I know how easy it is to assume there will be time later to think about what matters. There might be, or there might not. The difference is not dramatic. It's quiet. It shows up in what you postpone, what you reduce, what you refuse to look at because it disrupts your sense of control. I'm not here to give you answers. I didn't come back with a list. I came back with an awareness that clarity is available, but not passive. It doesn't force itself on you. It waits. And waiting is not the same as staying. If you're listening to this and feeling slightly unsettled, that's not an accident. That feeling is familiar to me now. It's the moment before you either explain something away or let it change you. I can't tell you which to choose. I can only tell you that assuming you have unlimited time to decide is a risk I didn't know I was taking until I wasn't given the option anymore.